Today, we want to talk about 3 failure points on the mine site. I'm Rob Leader. I'm president and founder of Western Protection Alliance here in Vancouver. Today, I have Jamie Rogers, our VP of Operations. Jamie's been with Western for 3+ decades, I guess. And Jamie, I wanted to ask you some of the key failure points on the mine site and see what your thoughts are on that.
All the failures in relation to security would fall on the shoulders of the security personnel. Inexperienced personnel that are fatigued because of the environment.
What kind of environment? Like shift work or?
Yeah, fatigue usually is going to affect personnel that are working long rotations, extended shifts. Usually personnel will be working 14 days in, 14 days out, 12-hour shifts. Quite often they'll be tasked with going beyond that 12 hours. It could be in relation to travel back and forth from the work site in its most basic form. But it's very easy to become fatigued, when you're working that amount of time.
And I know a lot of our projects have been remote. What kind of travel time are we talking about for staff?
Well, talking about getting into site initially, quite often it can be, anywhere from 6 to 12 hours just to get to site. And if they're asked to work that day and they're working a 12-hour shift, you can see how quickly that would get to the fatigue point. But quite often they're traveling in on average an 8-hour travel day, and then they usually get some rest, and then they would start their shift the next day where they would work at 12. And then quite often they'll have to travel during their shift back and forth from the work site location, which could be, 38 or 40 kilometers from accommodation. So there's some additional time tied in there. So if you don't take that into consideration, people are working in the fatigue area there as well.
Right. Interesting. And so what's another failure point then you see at the site level? Talking about fatigue being a big one. What are some of the other ones?
Well, lack of experience is a big failure point. If you don't have the right personnel on site, particularly in relation to remote location, it's quite challenging for people. And it takes some time for them to familiarize themselves with, the functionality of a remote site and to be able to properly do their job.
So it's not even inexperience, it's also inexperience with camp environments. Is that right?
Right. You can be a really experienced security person, but you've never worked in a camp, and you're finding yourself, having to deal with all the intricacies of being in a remote location and then having to layer your security knowledge on top of that. They need to work in conjunction with each other. It's skilled personnel working in a remote site. It's experience related.
So not being vegan or
that causes issues, particularly when there's no washroom close by.
Right. What other failure points have you seen in a site, and how can employers kind of prevent that in future?
Well, focusing once again on security, it's personnel, it's infrastructure, it's equipment. The locations present challenges, even when you're talking about equipment and communication. If you're talking about surveillance cameras, an example, they don't function on a network if there's no network. You need to have people monitoring the surveillance footage. If you don't, there can be something that's captured but isn't noticed.
Right. And what kind of technology maybe you could just talk about we're kind of using in the field now as far as our communication devices or remote and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so in this day and age, satellite communication has become fairly robust. And so long as there's a clear line of sight, there's quite a good chance that you're going to be able to have satellite communication. With the new Starlink systems and, gone are the days of the GPS spot notifiers, satellite radios, this sort of thing. There's even internal cell networks that can be created utilizing the new satellite technology. So it's getting better. But once remote location sites are always plagued with unknown variables that can throw a wrench into that communication issue. So once again, it falls back onto the level of expertise and experience of the security personnel to deal with those shortcomings.
So the failure point then in communications, it could be weather that takes the system down, right?
It definitely could be weather. It could be an overcast sky. If there's enough cloud cover, quite often you're not going to get a good stable satellite signal, right? It could be a firmware problem. It could be a power problem. There's a number of different things that might throw a wrench into that communication part of it. So once again, if somebody's experienced in that area, they're going to know what to do. They're just not going to expect it to function. Whereas if you're in the city, quite often people just expect things to function, and they do. There's a number of redundancies when it comes to communication in a city, whereas in a remote location there isn't.
Right. And other than that, what are some other failure points? So we talked about inexperienced personnel, fatigue, communication, and then I guess what's really important is experience in a camp environment. Depending where they are, they have to be self-sufficient and they have to have that kind of camp knowledge too, as opposed to, just somebody off the street.
Right. And there's also a level of complacency that happens, particularly in Canadian mines. An example, you're working in a remote location access control point, say a gate that's 3 kilometers from the highway, which is another 40 kilometers from the camp itself, and you're monitoring everything that passes that gate. And you've been working there for weeks, if not months, and there's very little issues that present, which in itself creates a bit of complacency. And you may look at a situation where there's contractors that are passing through that gate regularly, and you may get to know them. And if you don't properly screen one of those people and just wave them through, that's when you're going to find that there's some equipment that's gone missing. And security breaks down with complacency, I think. And you really need to stay on top of providing a robust security environment and, make sure that you don't become complacent in a remote access control point like that.
Right. Interesting. So the relationships can hurt the company in those situations then too, it sounds like.
Yeah, once again, I think it comes down to experience. If you have a security person who has seen that sort of thing happen before, if somebody's looking to commit a theft or something like that, they're going to play upon that. So if they can get to the point where they're waving at a security guard as opposed to stopping and having their vehicle scrutinized as they pass through the gate, then they're in a position to effect a theft.
Interesting. Well, that's good. I think that was a lot of good examples that failure points we see on remote sites. If people have any questions, you can direct them to your email and cell phone.
Yeah, absolutely. There's many things we can discuss. If anybody has any questions, they'd like to contact me directly. My email is rogers@westernalliance.ca, or you can contact me by phone at 604-880-6105.